Okay, I'll be beginning in three, two, one. Panel, the motion for today's debate is that this House supports the idea of anarchist political parties. First things first, we'd like to very clearly define what this means. Panel, we on-site government support the existence of the parties. We support the existence of anarchist parties. We support the option, we support having the option of an anarchist party in elections. We are not saying that anarchy is good, and we are simply saying that the option should exist. Now, one thing we'd like to clarify before we go into the debate is that in this debate, we are assuming a democratic government, because otherwise having political parties and having the representation of an anarchist political party simply does not make sense in the other forms of governance. So for the purpose of this debate, we'll be assuming that it's a democratic system of government. So coming to the first main thing, what happens when such an anarchist party is elected in a democratic government? So what does it mean for an anarchy party to be elected? Firstly, the government will dismantle. That's the entire point of anarchy. There is no governing body, there is no authority. So upon this election of an anarchist party, the government dismantles, obviously anarchy ensues, and essentially the only way for any sort of formal systems of governance or anything of that sort to be re-established is through the same means that was established earlier in the past, and that is when the people come together and choose to re-establish a new governance system, and only when they deem it necessary. We'd like to make this very clear. Now, moving on to the burdens of both teams in this debate. Panel, the burden on our side, on the government side of this debate, is solely to prove that allowing people to vote for such anarchist parties and allowing for these anarchy parties to exist and allowing for people with anarchist ideals to be represented is good for the country. And we do not need to prove that anarchy itself as an ideal or anarchy itself as a governance strategy is good. That's not the burden of this debate. Moving on to the burden of the opposition. The opposition's main goal here should be to prove that having an anarchist party at all in democratic elections, the sheer existence of an anarchist party in democratic elections is inherently bad and should not be allowed. And they also need to prove how that suppressing the ideals and suppressing the representation of people who subscribe to anarchist ideals is in some method morally viable. Now, coming to our core arguments in this debate. Firstly, regarding the freedom of choice for people in a democracy, and secondly, regarding the benefits of the existence of the anarchist parties. First of all, as mentioned, this is a democracy. A democracy is for the people, by the people, and of the people. If people who believe in anarchist ideals exist in a nation, and they have the right to be represented according to what a democracy is. They have the right to voice their opinion. They have the right to be heard, and they have the right for their ideals and for them to be taken into consideration during every rule making and every decision made for the people of the country by the government. This representation is key for democracy, and this representation is necessary. The best way to the best way to allow for this is to have anarchist political parties for the representation of these people with anarchist ideals. Moving on, if apart from this, apart from the freedom of choice, the idea of representation is morally necessary, is principally necessary in a democracy for these people. Denying them the right to voice their opinions, denying them the right to represent themselves is morally wrong and principally wrong and should not be allowed. Now, coming to the main core arguments, the main point of our speech, and that is the benefit of the existence of these anarchist parties. Panel, in such a model, in a democracy where an anarchist party can be elected, there are a total of only two situations that make it different from the current democracy, and those are the two cases we're going to focus on. Firstly, the case where these anarchist parties are not elected, where they simply exist, get a minority vote for every election, and simply exist in the background uh, of the elections. Panel, in this situation, the sheer fact that there is an option for the people to dismantle the government, for the people to choose anarchy over having any political party, the sheer existence of these parties puts pressure on all other existing governing political parties to act in favor of the people. The moment these parties stop acting in favor of the people, so the moment they start making bad decisions, the moment they start enacting policies that are not in favor of everyone, the moment essentially their rule becomes a negative for their people, there is a chance that they will never be re-elected again. There's a chance that the government will be dismantled the next time elections come around, and that is something that no political party can afford. And for this reason, the sheer existence of an anarchist party puts an immense amount of pressure on the on the other existing parties, whatever they may be, to actually make decisions, to actually enact policies that are good for their people. So through this pressure that's created by the existence of these parties, the existence of anarchist parties solely makes the existing government better if they are not elected. I'll take it later. Actually, I'll just go ahead. There's only 30 seconds.
How is it any different from the status quo where presently in the present political party, in the present political system, there are other parties that are creating pressure? That's the whole point of opposition and the political party in power. Right?
How is it so essentially, the main difference is that in the current status quo, even if they lose an election now, they still stand a chance to make up for it in a further election. There's no thought that, oh wait, if we lose this election, this can be the last election that we ever participate in. If they fuck up, then it's just over forever. That thought is not there. But now that pressure is there. If they mess up to if they actually mess up to the point where they're a net negative to their people, there's a chance that the government will never exist again. And thus, the sheer existence of the parties makes the existing government better. That's the main difference from the status quo. There's a difference in the pressure, there's a difference in the threat. Now, moving on to the case where they are elected. Panel, the only situation, the only single possible situation in which an anarchist government is elected is when essentially more than 50% of the people, obviously a majority, votes for this anarchist party. When the people who currently support whatever party it may be, whatever ideals they may have, the people who currently support any government of any form choose that having a government is worse than not having government. The point where the government fails so miserably that they are a net negative to their people, the point where they make the lives of their people worse. Only when a state reaches that point, only when a state reaches a point where the government should no longer exist, when the government existing is a net bad thing and essentially degrades the life of its people. Only at that point, only at the point where anarchy is a better option than having a government, is when an anarchist party will get elected. Everyone knows well and clear what voting for an anarchy party means, and everyone knows everyone knows what an anarchy party getting elected means. And the only situation in which an anarchy party would get elected, and the only situation where the government would dismantle, is when the government should be dismantled, and is when the government is a net negative to its people. On that note, I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, PM, for your speech.
Yeah. So now the first part, the proposition comes and tells you here is that anarchism itself shouldn't be a matter of discussion in this debate. In this debate. But the thing is, we are talking about political parties, and we are assuming that it's in the context of a democracy, a democratic republic. And now anarchism is a policy which would counteract the very basis of such a democracy itself. And that is why it has to be a matter of discussion. The very gravity of that ideal is what makes it a matter of discussion and an important matter of discussion in this debate. Because existence, or even supporting that ideal, or even supporting the existence of representation of that ideal, will in many ways counteract the basis of this debate. And that is why that ideal has to be discussed. And therefore, now having established that, I move on with what the burdens are. We have to be very clear here that what we want to argue today is that supporting or having such representation or having such political parties is, one, logically frivolous, because it's a clear contradiction when we look in the long term. Two, it is counterproductive when it comes to any implementation, because the proposition is giving you a very wavy picture of what things should be, of what ideals are, while conveniently ignoring any possibility of what the implementation of such a thing will look like in any democracy. So now the Prime Minister comes and tells you that we believe in the representation of of people with anarchist ideals. How will these people be represented? In a country like India, they'll be represented by their members of parliament. So let's get this straight. The proposition wants an anarchist party to sit in the parliament and or an anarchist representative to sit in the parliament. A representative whose very sole reason of being there is to reject the parliament. So that's logically frivolous to begin with. So they tell you that this representation is important. So now they gave you two case-by-case analyses. One where this party doesn't win and two where this party does win. What I'm telling you is that if this party doesn't win, or if any of its representatives or if any of its people standing for that seat do not win, then there is no representation to begin with. The representation they harp on about, that does not exist if a member of parliament of that respective party does not win a seat in parliament, or if a proposed member of parliament does not win a seat in parliament. And case two, where they say that the party somehow ends up winning, or if the representative somehow ends up winning, we are talking about a representative sitting in an institution with the sole purpose of being against that institution. And by doing so, by sitting in that institution, they have to contradict their own ideology. Therefore, you absolutely, in any case, cannot have an anarchist political party that stays true to its idea. And thereby, any logical implication you get from electing, or the phrase of electing an anarchist political party, is a logical contradiction and cannot exist. Now this is very important because, see, now here I come from the logical or the abstract part of my arguments or my side's arguments to the implementation and practical parts of it. So let's say we are in a democracy, which we are, and that's what any debate, any college debate will assume, that we are indeed in a democracy. Now, to conduct democracy or to conduct elections or to continue the impartiality of these elections, you need institutions. You need institutions that conduct these elections. You need institutions like the judiciary that would hold things that would chastise or reprimand any misconduct in these elections. So here's the thing: the validity of an election is given to you, is enforced by some sort of an authority structure. Now, as soon as an anarchist party is elected or a representative is elected, they come in the understanding that this institution itself will be dissolved. And therefore, when they say that, when to quote the Prime Minister, that it's over, that it will never come again, what's over is democracy. Anarchy cannot exist with democracy, and that is a moral tenet of any debate we have on any college stage. That the very foundation of our discussion is that we are in a democracy, and normatively we say that morally democracy is something we're striving for. Anarchy cannot behave well or cannot exist with that. Now, so in essence, what I've said as of now is two things. One, an anarchist political party is a logically frivolous notion. An anarchist political party is an oxymoron. Two, if somehow by dealing with their internal dichotomy, by trading with their ideology, somehow they find themselves in power. They reduce their ideology, or they trade with their ideology. They find themselves in power. Second part is that this leads to many practical conclusions about the very conduction of elections, about the very process and concept of governance itself, or electing a government or forming a government. Now, after this, I can easily talk about things like anarchism itself. And we have seen across history the problem with paid fire services. the problem with having private militias, the problem with any place having anarchism is what has to be discussed after I have already discussed the logical frivolous nature of it. And that part and those parts are what my team will argue upon later. So in essence, what our argument is that the proposition side cannot stand because it's a logical contradiction to itself. And two,
your time is up.
And just one last sentence. And two, if somehow they figure out a way to get rid of this contradiction, which doesn't exist, the way that doesn't exist, the contradiction obviously exists, then there are practical challenges that they will never be able to deal with. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your speech. Now let us get to the DPM.
Yeah,
Please start with the counter.
Yeah, am I audible and visible?
Loud and clear.
You are.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Oh, pure preference, you can interrupt me. Sorry, can you start the timer again? I'm so sorry. 3, 2, 1, start. So again, we need to look at the motion again. The motion says that the House supports the existence of anarchist political parties. Now the leader of opposition comes and tells us that proposition said that we don't want to discuss anarchism. We never said that, because obviously it is about an anarchist political parties, so it would be a part of the debate. What we meant was that the anarchy itself being a good or a bad system is not the main motion of the debate. The main motion of the debate is giving people the option of having anarchist political parties in the system, in the existing system. Now, again, the leader of opposition keeps on saying things about how democracy and anarchy cannot exist at the same time. So this in itself, first of all, is a big statement with no valid proof and no logical explanations. I cannot see how this cannot happen, because now disagreements cannot not only happen because the two things can't exist together. Now, one form of anarchy already exists in the society through the means of internet. We have the internet, and through this internet we have anonymity. So the existence of these two things already creates one element of anarchy in the society that we have. But what we want to say is that since this element of anarchy already exists, why not give it a representation so it becomes more open to the public? The people know what people are, the anarchist ideologists people are talking about, and then they will make better decisions whether to support them or not. Again, one more thing that the leader of opposition mentioned that I would like to clarify is that they said that if they don't win seats, then there will be no representation and stuff like that. Now, here's the confusion arises. A representation does not mean majority in the House. A representation just means that we are giving the people of this ideology the chance to represent themselves, the chance to stand in elections, and the opportunity to present their ideas to the people through a public way. This does not mean that we will be giving them seats in the parliament. It is different from reservation, obviously. The opposition is confusing between representation and reservation. And we are not talking about giving the majority right away. Again, this can happen in the long term at some point, but this is not the debate is about. So I'll not focus on this point. Now, allowing people with these kind of ideologies to have a representation, I'll tell you why it's good. It will help people to evaluate better what their motives are, as I earlier said. So some people, if this does not happen, people might join these forces, these secret anarchist societies, whatever, on the internet, without actually knowing what it actually is. And if they ever want to overthrow the government, that has to be through protests, coups, and violence, basically. But giving the people an anarchist party gives them the option to present their views better and to present a no confidence in the government in a much easier way. But obviously, this will not happen instantly, and we are not saying we want it to happen instantly. We still support democracy, but if at one point people choose that this should happen, as the PM was saying, that this will only happen when people have lost all faith in the government, when there is no political party who is doing justice to what people want, what people's demands are, when there is not a single organization, not a single coalition that is giving justice to people, only then will this kind of a situation arise. And hence, I don't see why is it a problem in democracy. Again, as the PM has already mentioned, this will actually help democracy because this will motivate political parties to work on people's demands better, and because of the same reasons that I just mentioned, that they don't want government to end, they don't want their power to end, they don't want a possibility of their power to end. Yeah, I'll take the POR.
Sir, given that most democracies today are representative democracies, how do you expect representation in terms of policy to take place if there is not a single seat in parliament or if there's not a single member of parliament?
So, okay, again, we need to go back to the fundamentals of democracy. People will vote for the people they want to vote for, right? So if people don't want these kinds of ideologies, these kinds of policies to be present in the parliament, they will just not vote for them. And I don't see why you are bringing this up again. As I just mentioned, representation does not mean reservation at all. If there are 0 seats in the parliament of this party, the scenario that you are presenting, this is, I don't see the problem in that. This is quite possible. This fits well with what democracy means. And again, people will vote for them if they want them to be there, right? So also being in the parliament is a way of proposing your policies to inside the government. But this does not mean that they cannot do it if they have no seats in the parliament, because if they are political parties, they have some sort of social movement, they have some sort of social influence, and then they can raise voices of these people because these are organized groups when they are political parties and not just random protests on the internet or whatever. So again, the motion is about the existence of political parties and not about giving them representation in the parliament directly. Unfortunately, I had to reiterate this again as an answer to the POI. Now, the biggest issue with most systems is that there are 2 or 3 major political parties, and they just have to be better than other political parties. They don't have a real competition. They don't have to be the best. So again, as I said, having an anarchist political party will motivate the other political parties to work better, to run the government better, so that the government can keep on existing and not, and then it's just helping democracy in this way. And this is where I'd like to conclude my speech. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. Now I'll welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Please begin with a countdown. Hello.
Audible?
Yeah,
Am I audible?
loud and clear.
Right. So I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, just to bring to your attention something that the previous speaker said. The entire idea of an anarchist political party is an oxymoron in and of itself, because anarchy is against the idea of a government as defined by the Prime Minister. As defined by the Prime Minister, if an anarchic political party comes into power, it would mean the complete dissolution of the government. Therefore, these political leaders of an anarchic party are going against their own ideology by even participating in the idea of a parliament. Let us take it easy on them and concede that it is a means to an end. through which they are violating their own ideals. The reason why this side of a house doesn't support the idea of an anarchist political party is because it has the potential for a complete collapse of society and stripping citizens of their fundamental rights. Our burden is to prove that we should not support anarchist political parties. It is to prove to you that the idea of an anarchist political party is very, very dangerous. Firstly, the Prime Minister said it will only come into power if a majority votes, if more than 50% votes. Well, this is not necessary. More than 50% is not the right figure. Very often in elections, the party wins by splitting its opponent's votes. So majority of the people, in the sense of at least half, is not necessary for them to come into power. Moving on, there are many situations in which people will vote for these parties, contrary to what the government wants you to believe. For example, let's say there is hyperinflation in a country. Well, we have 2-3 countries in the world like that right now. Let's say the economy of a country is collapsing. Well, that seems to happen every decade. Well, let's say there's a global pandemic and people are losing their livelihoods and businesses are collapsing. In such situations, people are not very pleased with their government. Do governments do a good job at dealing with these situations? Well, not always. In fact, they do a pretty shoddy job. But there is somebody doing a job. There is a reserve bank to issue stimulus checks. You still have laws in place that ensure companies can issue for bankruptcy. You have an entire legal, political and economic system that prevents the society from collapsing completely into something disastrous. And we can see this right now. People are very displeased with their governments, but the governments are the only reason why people still have jobs while businesses are still running. Society needs structure, and very often there are disasters, there are problems which the government is not directly responsible for, but the people bear the brunt of. In such situations, there is a very high potential for anarchist political parties to take power, because people are simply unhappy with their current governments and they naively believe that the absence of a government would be better. Now that we have established that it is possible for an anarchist political party to come into power, let us discuss why it is so dangerous. As the Prime Minister said, it is a reset button on the government. It is not a reset government, it is a kill button on the government. It immediately and indefinitely ends any democratic republic. Firstly, they falsely assume that there will be another election, that if people don't like the anarchist political parties, they can bring the old parties back. Well, if you have dissolved the government, you will have nobody to elect because there is no parliament, there is no structure anymore. You cannot go back. That is the fundamental problem. Now, why is there a problem in not going back? Well, let's understand this through the prisoner's dilemma. We assume that in the absence of order, people will behave in a rational way. Well, humans are impulsive. They cannot be relied on to always act in what is in favor of the society as a large. When you dissolve a government, you are stripping people of fundamental rights. There are people who rely on the government for basic needs. There are people who are employed by this government, and they are not going to vote for the dissolution of a government. Because this is something you need to understand. In a democracy, people vote for different parties. If an anarchist party, let's say, gets 50% of the vote, you still have 50% of the people who wanted a government, and now they no longer have a government. You are stripping them of basic needs and services, access to utilities like water and electricity, access to food. People rely on food stamps. Their employment will be stripped of them. All government employees or people allied in government services. Now, what is going to happen in the absence of power? You create a power vacuum. This creates a very high potential for autocratic regimes to take power, because all of a sudden there is nothing to keep individuals' powers in check. All of a sudden there is nothing keeping people in an orderly manner, and people are free to act however they want. A power battle will ensue. Even if more than 50% of the people decide to reform and go back to the old ways, you cannot impose control on the people who no longer want a government. people who have gotten power due to this power vacuum that has been created. Without severe coercive measures, you cannot re-establish society. Now, the only situation in which giving people the option of completely doing away with their government is justified is if you put a person's personal choice and liberty that is exercised through their vote for this party over everybody else's fundamental human rights. And this is where it all falls. Personal choice needs to be confined. This is something that we have learned over hundreds and hundreds of years. This is why we have formed law and order departments. This is why we have formed governments, because it works. Policing saves lives. Criminal courts allow people to live in peace and grow a country. That is why this side of the house is so opposed to the idea of political parties, because it bears the potential of complete societal collapse, and that societal collapse strips everybody of their fundamental human rights. I'll take the POI if there is any.
Your time's up. Sure.
Protect your time, so you can't accept any of yours.
So I'll move on to my concluding statements. So to summarize, we are against the idea of an anarchist political party because of the potential it bears for complete societal collapse. We have established to you that it is possible for this party to be elected in situations where the government is the only viable solution out of the problem. It is also possible for this party to be elected because people are simply unhappy with the current parties, and we need to understand that the solution is a better political party that better represents the people's interests and not a kill button on the government that takes away the very solution of the problems that the people are facing. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I believe that we have a very strong position in this debate.
Yeah, thank you for your speech. Now let's move on to the government whip. Please start with the countdown.
Give me 5 seconds.
Sure.
Am I visible?
Yeah, visible and audible.
Okay. Yeah, 5 seconds. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Okay. So first of all, let's try to look at the core points of the opposition, right? So they start by their whole thinking is based on this ideology that anarchy is and an anarchist party is an oxymoron within a democracy. So, like, first of all, just because some people cannot handle nuances and they cannot move beyond existing systems with their imagination does not mean something is impossible. You have to show a logical chain or any logical argument towards why these two things are completely contradictory, right? And we got none of those. And I tell you how these are actually not contradictory. So, first of all, democracy is about freedom of choice, and every ideology having representation is absolutely essential. Even a lot of times people do not agree with, let's say, conservative ideologies, but that does not mean that we cannot have conservative political parties. So people not agreeing with any notion that a particular political party holds does not mean that the political party should be abolished itself. Also, again, like then they go into how we talked about hand-wavily about the implementation. So again, like their whole debate is structured around how the debate is defined itself. They've not stuck to the motion, and they've tried to challenge the motion throughout the debate without actually like giving any logical framework why an anarchist political party is an oxymoron. They've just made blanket statements. So they say, so one example that they tried to bring up was that we shouldn't harp about representation if no one wins a seat. Nobody talked about no one winning a seat. That was a complete misinterpretation, and I personally feel it was misinterpreted on purpose, because we were talking clearly about winning a majority vote or winning in such a way so as to establish a government. We were not talking about winning individual seats. We are completely fine with anarchist political parties winning some seats and having the representation. That is what the whole motion is based on, that these obviously if we support the existence of an anarchist political parties, we also support that they might get some seats, and that is perfectly fine with us. And again, the opposition keep saying that they keep mentioning that a person who does not agree with the parliament should not be able to sit in parliament. Again, that is, I completely disagree with that, because a lot of people in any society will not agree with a particular institution. That does not mean that they should be thrown out of the society. And also, even an anarchist political party does not necessarily have to mean that they do not agree with the parliament itself. Anarchy is not binary. It can be in forms where you disagree with certain authorities, and it doesn't mean that people cannot come together and people cannot think rationally. If you start assuming that anarchy means irrationality, then obviously there is no debate to be had. But what the opposition needs to realize is that there is a reason such notions exist, and these reasons were brought up by our previous speakers. There are a swath of existing problems with existing institutions, and the only way that people can currently go against that is basically by resorting to violence. And we've seen this violence occur throughout history, so I'm not going to go into examples here. So another thing that they bring up in a similar framework is that anarchy can't be implemented because it is equivalent to paid fire brigades and private militia. These are again logical jumps. Without anarchy, you can have public services. There is a whole field around decentralizing governance, whether it be through technology, whether it be through other means, whether it be just to spreading governance to the grassroots level. And it seems that the opposition is running 100 years behind in time with regards to what the current trends towards, what the modern population thinks about how ideal governance should be. And they seem to forget that decentralization is a key trend, and it completely aligns with the idea of not having extremely powerful centralized authorities. And if you don't have an anarchist political party to represent these views, you will never be able to transition to them, because for the existing governments, it is completely against their own payoffs to actually allow any. It can be completely against their own payoffs to actually allow ideologies like decentralization to exist, or ideologies like breaking down certain authorities to exist. We've seen this in the resistance to reducing police brutality in the US. The government doesn't want that, and that is why an anarchist political party is necessary, as my previous speakers have also brought up. They chime about all these hyperinflation scenarios and how will we deal with the pandemic. Again, all of these things can be resolved without a government, and it's not like we've never had societies that do not have these authorities. People have had, there have been flourishing societies which have not had major centralized authorities, and these societies, no one can say that these societies were not happy. And there is no, even if in the past these societies were not developed, there is no reason or no logical reason, at least brought up by the opposition, why this cannot happen in the future. I'll take a POI here.
So since you agree to the notion of anarchist members of parliament, so an anarchist member of legislative assembly is tasked to conduct government vaccinations. Do you want that member of legislative assembly to say no?
This is completely strawmanning the whole argument. You're giving me a particular example which I obviously do not agree with, but you don't realize, and this is again like a core problem in your entire argument throughout your speeches. And thank you for giving me the opportunity of bringing this up. But the key point is that whatever harms you're bringing up can and already do exist on both sides of the house. Whenever you come up and say that that people will lose human rights, people might lose government jobs, that can happen with any political party. That is not exclusive to anarchist political parties. Bad situations can happen, and there are hundreds of ways I can attack current political parties. But unlike the opposition, the government did not want to enter into these strong particular examples, because that is not the whole point. We are arguing on principles and not on the extreme bad scenarios, because they can happen on both sides of the house. Also, another thing that is important here is that the opposition keeps making statements like people will lose human rights. what they seem to completely forget is that most human right violations that currently take place are due to existing authorities and are due to like governments which went rotten. Or essentially, if you don't have these authorities, and anarchist political parties can be a way to actually retain these human rights. They actually improve human rights by decentralizing the government. So I do not see how any of these opposition points hold up, and actually in a reasonable logical framework. Their whole argument relies on straw manning, and thus, like, I would like to conclude my speech.
Thank you for that speech. So the opposition whip can start with a countdown.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Am I visible?
Yeah. Shashwat, you can turn off your camera. Yeah. You can start.
Yeah, 3, 2, 1. It is very disappointing to see that side proposition, in especially the last speech, has completely gone against everything that they have stood for and said in their first two speeches. And I will give you examples and I will substantiate on why I'm saying this, right? So first, the government whip comes up and tells us that he's accepting the premise where individual MPs and individual seats are possible, and individual seats are the whole point of representation, and why we're having this motion today. Great. But what DPM has definitely come up and said is that this anarchical political party is a representation of ideals that the people hold, is a representation of the anarchical ideals that the people hold. And this is exactly what we are trying to say, that this is a misrepresentation. That what DPM said is that people will be educated, that people will further be able to understand the true essence of anarchism through these political parties. And if there is a political candidate who wins a seat, if there is an MP, then there is absolutely no case in which he's sticking to his ideology and he's actually educating the people about the right form of this ideology, right? So this is what so throughout the three speeches of side pro, this is what we've got from this is the argument that we've got, right? That the government will dismantle. The government will dismantle in a very extreme case, and new government will form only when deemed necessary. But what side proposition clearly fails to understand is that decentralization is not a part of anarchism, right? Decentralization is a very important part to their entire argument, and this can be clearly seen in the in government whip speech, which can be clearly thrown out, right? The government whip also said that parliament and anarchy can coexist, when again it's a misrepresentation of ideas. And this is what they have said right from the beginning, that they only support the existence of a political party so that it is morally wrong to suppress freedom. And in our DLO speech, we have told why a freedom of this in freedom in some cases needs to be contained, that policing leads to a peaceful coexistence, right? And side proposition are creating their own problems. We have told you how the three essential institutions of democracy are completely torn down if there is an existence of an anarchical political party, right? The judiciary does not exist. The legislature is an oxymoron in itself, because an anarchical MP, an MP who is from this anarchical political party, is trying to impose an authority, or is trying to be an authoritative figure and trying to impose legislature, and this also gets thrown out. And then they have also said that execution and the executive goes to hell because there is no implication and there is no importance of this institution, right? So the basic tenets of the democracy are completely thrown out, and this is what side government is failing to understand, right? Now, side government has told us that side government has told us that hearing the opinions and ideas of people are important, and we believe so. Yes, we believe that this is indeed true, and we believe that there are other better forums, there are other better platforms on which people with anarchical beliefs can express themselves, can understand more of the topic, and can be true to their ideals instead of this gross misrepresentation that is taking place on their side of the house, right? Side government also does not propose any useful measures. They want to simply, as my DLO said, they just want to simply press a kill button instead of a reset button. They don't understand the whole. They don't understand the whole policy. They don't understand the whole mechanics of how an election takes place, and they believe that immediately after an election takes place and no government comes into a power, immediately the same political parties with the same ideologies and everything remains the same, they will stand for elections again. This of course and they call our examples as extreme. Side government also does not take into account the lower minority groups and like lower representation that would have otherwise gone to people with who are dependent on government policies, people who are dependent on the need for the government. Like my DLO said, right? There are people who are right now dependent on say food stamps, or people who are right now dependent on shelters, etc. Side government has also told us that there is no the example of private military does not exist. But imagine this scenario, right? And we have continuously told this hypothetical that imagine this scenario where you have anarchical fire department, and one dude is just like, no, I don't want to go and save a fire, even though literally everything is burning down. We are attacking this on two principles, right? One, the existence of such a political party, and the second of the anarchical ideas that this political party represents and is trying to propagate, right? Next, side government has also told us in their definition, and we're sticking to the definition, that we are supporting the option of existence of such a political party, right? And we have told you throughout our three speeches why the clear notion and why such a suggestion is clearly misinterpreted for both the people, and why the existence of a political party is harmful to the society. We have told you there are three stakeholders here, right? There are two stakeholders here, one the citizens and one the government themselves. The government is obviously benefited on side opposition's house, where we are clearly supporting, where we're maintaining the infrastructure of the government instead of tearing it apart, or what side proposition is doing. We're protecting the rights of citizens. Side proposition, in their last speech especially, they have come up and told us that there are human rights violations on both sides. Again, what side proposition fails to understand is that that if it exists on both sides of the house, then supporting anarchist political parties has no benefits and has only harm, right? And this is why we are telling that the citizens are not benefited in any way. They are in fact they in fact have negatives. We are telling you how the government is benefited, and very simply we are giving you solid reasons on the three essential tenets of a debate, right? We are telling you why we are economically being benefited, why we are socially being benefited, and why we are politically being benefited, at the same time maintaining the infrastructure and the institutions that a democracy upholds. And this is why we clearly win this debate. I am proud to oppose. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your speech. Now let's go to the opposition reply.
I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, let me show you why we won this debate, going speech by speech. What did we get from the Prime Minister's speech? Well, they very conveniently gave us the definition of what would happen if an anarchist political party would come into power. That is, what are an anarchist political party's ideals? He clearly said it would involve dissolving or dismantling the government. We showed you how dismantling the government dismantles the society without any turning back. Now, the Deputy Prime Minister's speech placed emphasis on personal choice and why it should be allowed. Well, we showed you how the very existence of anarchist parties and consequently anarchist members of parliament is a bane. Anarchist MPs would fundamentally want to weaken the government, as the definition given to us by the government. Therefore, they are taking up seats in the parliament that otherwise would have gone to MPs who would have proposed actually useful policies, MPs that may have represented minorities. We told you how an anarchist political party in an election splits the vote and how this weakens the democratic process. We also proved to you that giving people this choice is dangerous because it places their personal choice and liberty over the fundamental human rights of everybody else. Granted, the government said that it was an extreme case, but in a debate, we need to consider all possibilities. And based on the definition given to us by the government, this is a possibility. Now, the whip speech completely redefined anarchist political parties, which is not something the whip is supposed to do. The whip included decentralization as a central tenet of anarchy, something that hadn't been brought up in that point. However, the whip also conveniently said in his speech that MPs who seek to decentralize power exist on both sides of the house. Therefore, anarchist political parties bring nothing new to the table. They only carry the risk of completely dismantling society. Now, how did we prove to you that the status that a world in which anarchist political parties are not allowed is a better world? We showed you the fundamental problems with anarchy and how in the current system, people still have the power to change the government. They still have the power to elect people who they want. At the same time, we are not completely centralizing power. We can see this in the real world. There are countries without anarchist political parties which are highly decentralized. We have living proof that you do not need an anarchist political party to achieve decentralization, to give people personal liberties and freedoms. Moreover, we also showed to you how the entire idea of an anarchist political party, and as the whip said, a member of parliament belonging to the anarchist political party holding representation in the government, goes fundamentally against the entire ideal of anarchism. How this MP would be betraying his ideal by exercising power in the parliament, by taking decisions on behalf of his people, by not letting people voluntarily take whatever decisions they want. Therefore, we believe that we have proved that every stakeholder in this debate is better on our side, the government, which is only guaranteed to exist on our side, the people who are only guaranteed rights on our side. We also showed you how agreeing to the proposition of introducing anarchist political parties is dangerous and therefore it should not be allowed. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. The government reply, please.
Am I visible and audible?
You're not visible to. Oh fuck.
You might have turned on Inca.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah,
Okay,
you're visible and audible.
Just give me a few seconds to begin. I have a notebook that I'll be referring to. So. Okay, I'll be beginning in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it should be obvious that side government takes this debate, and that too by a landslide. And I'll analyze why by going over what we get from side opposition, what we get from side government. Firstly, from side opposition, all they do in their initial part of the speech is make blanket statements like democracy is morally correct, with no analysis whatsoever on that regard. They also make blanket statements against the motion directly. So, things like anarchist political parties are logical contradictions and cannot exist. And throughout this line of argumentation, the only thing they achieve is trying to say that the wording of the motion does not make sense and do not actually engage with our model at all, and thus provide no value to the debate whatsoever. The only real argumentation we get from them comes in the form of misinterpretation and exaggeration when they talk about how easily people elect an anarchist government. And this is something that we have been addressing in all of our speeches from the very beginning. We very clearly proved to you that the only situation which an anarchist party is elected is when the government is a net negative, not when the government makes a few mistakes, not when people are simply unhappy with one party, not when some people lose their jobs because of economic crisis, not when the government is just not great, could be better, but when the government is directly bad to the people, when the government consistently performs so bad, not even neutral, but objectively bad, to a point where it makes the lives of the people of that country worse. Worse to the extent that an anarchy, that the absence of a government is better for people and their survival than actually having the government. That is the only situation in which an anarchist government gets elected, and that is something we have very clearly proved to you from the very first speech of from our side. And this is something that the opposition side tries very hard to misinterpret, to exaggerate, and to undermine throughout the debate. And that is their only form of argumentation in this debate. Now, coming to what we have told you in this debate. Firstly, we very clearly defined and outlined the burdens of the debate. So the burdens we identified for our side were to prove that having these anarchist parties in democratic elections, the sheer existence of them is a net good. And that is something we have proved to you in both scenarios. The scenario where they don't get elected and where they pressure the other parties into performing better with the threat of not having government and with the threat that they will not be able to be, the threat that they will not be able to be re-elected. And that pressure is good for the government. And the fact that when they are elected, the only situation in which they are elected is when the government is making the lives of the people worse to the point where not having government is good for the people. We have very clearly proved all of this to you. And coming to the burdens of the opposition, the burdens that we identified for the opposition were to prove that having an anarchist party in democratic elections is inherently bad, which they did not, which they tried to do through the form of, again, as I mentioned, misinterpretation and exaggeration, which does not stand. And two, to prove that suppressing the ideals and representation of these people is somehow morally viable, which they did not touch upon at all. So panel, all in all, in this debate, on their side, they barely argue against our model. And the only way they do this is, again, through the form of exaggeration, through the form of misinterpretation, through the form of strong manning our arguments. The other thing they do throughout the case is they simply attack the wording of the motion, which holds no value whatsoever in our debate. They only argue that it is bad that the party that the anarchist party being elected is bad for the people, and we have very clearly proven to you that the only time that the only situation in which these parties get elected is when having not having a government is better than having a government, when the governments are a net negative. This is something that we very clearly proved to you. And all in all, the opposition side fails to fulfill their burdens at all. On our side, we very clearly proved to you why having these parties is better. We proved to you in all possible scenarios. We proved to you that the government is meant to exist for the people, and the people are better off in our model, and we fulfill all of our burdens perfectly. And for those reasons, we feel that we take this debate by a landslide. Very proud to propose. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Let's Gladys will go to the Discord PC.
Wait, so do we leave from here? Like, do we leave the call? Or?
Let's just unmute it.
So leave the call and then rejoin one at a time. And yeah.
Oh, right.
So one person comes at a time, and we'll be timing the ad speeches as well. So one person comes at a time, gives your ad speech, and then calls the next ad. You are allowed to listen to the next ad speech if you want to, but it's not necessary. This was a fun debate.
Nice debate.
Oh yeah, wait, Anish, wait, you're not adding Anish?
No.
Did your interview
because
happen,
no, it didn't happen yet. It's supposed to happen right now. Like, it's supposed to be happening right now, but I guess like schedule.
Okay. What was your preferences? Opposition?
Theirs would have been 3-1-2, no?
I think ours were 3-2.
Oh, they vetoed one. Okay.
They vetoed one. We wanted one.
Yeah.
We didn't really want to veto
one
anything.
as well.
We just weren't confident in our ability to come up with 7 minutes of speech for the first.
I see.
Yeah.
All of the motions are fun. We actually didn't want to veto.
Mayank really wanted the first. I think Adu wanted the first one. Yeah, and Mayank also wanted the first one. There was like a meme template thing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just imagining showing that in the recording. And I was like, this will be fun. Let's do this.
Yeah.
Also, I should. Do I stop? I'll just.
No,
start.
we can cut out the waiting parts, no?
No, but does it make more sense to like merge two videos or segment one? I guess segment one is easier. Like let it be recorded. Also, don't worry, this won't be uploaded anyway. I'll make sure like we remove it before you put it up.
Raghav is not very well known for cutting videos. Huh?
Ah, I see. So Pahul, will you be our editor?
I mean, okay.
All you have to do is crop now.
Yeah. That I know.
Like-
That's the only thing I know. Need editing.
But like, are we uploading like everything or just the finals?
We'll probably there's a good chance we'll upload all three. I mean the two so far have been pretty good examples.
Okay.
But,
Can you make the first two unlisted, like only link people can see?
oh right, people can see them on streams already. Probably. I'm not sure. I'll need to take a look at that. It was fun debating after so long. This was a good motion. I just said they'll be here in a minute.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yeah, we can hear you. Just give me 1 second to set up a
Wait,
timer
am
for
I
the
am I
Ajri
supposed to
system.
announce the results, or am I just supposed to give my verdict?
Okay, so you're supposed to announce the result. If there's dissent, you're supposed to announce the outcome of the Ajri, and then you're
Mhm.
supposed to move ahead with your OA.
Right. So
Also,
there was a.
wait, hold on. The OA will be timed, by the way. So just give me a second to set it up.
Okay.
Okay, sharing my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yeah,
Okay, that's not the right thing. Okay, good.
Right. So let me begin. There was a 2-1 split, and the debate goes to op. Now I was the one who voted for the government. Now let me get to why. So to begin with, I think that there was okay. So the burden I think everyone agrees upon was that this should the option exist. Now, right off the bat, I feel that this was a easier burden for governments. When I'm looking at my arguments, I'm looking from that perspective. I'm not talking about anything else. Government gave that definition. The option should exist, just the fact, and opposition agreed. So that's the debate which I'm basing on. And the main clash that I think was there was the death of democracy. That's what I'm terming it. So opposition comes, and opposition I think did a fairly good job as telling me what what death of democracy will end up at, and what will happen if this democracy gets taken away. However, the reason I gave to government was primarily because of two factors. So one, when Pahul came and spoke about the internet, I felt that there was an example of anarchy that doesn't necessarily have the harms that op is telling me it does. And then Shashwat came and elaborated on what exactly a decentralization could mean, and why the opposition's case is an edge case. And I sort of brought that argument. So in my opinion, that particular clash, that okay, death of democracy happens, I feel that this was a clash that was close because of issues on both the side. The fact that I got a good argumentation, good analysis on op side. At the same time, the fact that there was one jump that is like, okay, anarchism happens, and then you immediately move on to private militaries and a lot of factors like that. I don't think that connection was very clear. Even though it was sort of self-implied, I cannot take that argument. And the fact that I think Shashwat's argument came at the end, I can't give it the same weight as a constructive. So this was, in my opinion, a very close clash. However, the reason I gave this debate to government even after this close clash, which I'm not entirely sure who I gave it to, was the fact that they tell me that okay, that option should exist. That option puts pressure on the government. That option is there for specific reasons, and the very existence of this option, since that being the burden, I didn't get any. I don't think there was much clash on opposition side on why this option should not exist. Even though it was there, okay, you're saying that with the harms that there are harms, so the option should probably not exist. I'm not sure that I buy that argument for the same reason that I'm not even sure those harms necessarily happen. And then talking about the death of democracy clash, one reason that I felt that the government sort of were able to make it a close clash was because they come and tell me that when this happens, this is for a specific reason. It's because the government is that bad. And even though I think there was some interesting argumentation on that is not 50%. There can be much less than 50% who dismantle this entire structure. I still feel that government had a close competition in that clash. So that the death of democracy clash was something that that had flaws on both the sides, but at the same time, that's why I'm forced to sort of take it as a close clash. But the fact that the options think that the fact that the option should exist at all is why I gave it to government. So I am kind of done. So if there are any questions, I can just like take them right now.
I have a few questions. So, firstly, did you or did you not weigh the like how much did you weigh the arguments made from side government about or like the clash that went on about when exactly this fall of democracy happens and how easily it happens? Because there's argumentation from op saying that it happens very easily with simply unhappiness in the government, and there's argumentation from side government that where we try to very clearly mention that the only case in which this happens is when the government is a net negative. How did this weigh in on your decision?
Yeah, I did wait. That's a normal. Like, so when I talk about no confidence motion, that is what I'm talking about. I'm obviously not entirely buying the argument that it can happen very easily, or that it is like it was like I think Anirudh's point stands at some extent that it's not necessarily 50% or more than 50%. And even if it is that, I don't think by others people should be taken away. But your point that it's not something that will easily happen is definitely there. I mean, it's around the reasons I feel that death of democracy might not be as harmful or might be for a specific reason. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that is it. If there are no other questions.
Yeah, I had it up. So when we're talking about, so basically what the main burden that you actually, that since it was the primary burden of the debate, since you gave it to side prop, that is why you gave the entire debate to side prop, was the presence of a choice, right? Like, so did our arguments about how the presence of a choice in itself being a misrepresentation of the ideals that the people will possess, how much did it weigh against the very fact that it just exists?
So I felt that most of your reasons to why this choice should not exist was because of drawing it directly to the harm. So that's what I felt. That okay, so you're saying this choice should not exist because it is so harmful on the other side. I do not agree that there was a necessary argumentation on okay that this freedom of choice shouldn't exist at all for some specific reason. I don't think there was argumentation on that or why anarchy in itself should not be a part of the choices that can be made. I felt that a lot of it was tied into the harms that you were mentioning, and like I had this discussion with Aj as well. The very fact that I don't believe that those harms necessarily happen is why I gave it to proposition. So yeah, like if you could maybe had done more analysis or at least had done more analysis to my I don't know my contentment, I might have like given all those clashes to you. But I don't believe that the harms necessarily happen, and I believe that government was able to tell me that it may not necessarily happen. Yeah. Cool. Thanks for having me. If you want, you can DM me as well. That's also fine. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayank.
Any second now. Okay, cool. Yeah, start. So, right, I'm pretty sure by now you should have heard what Mayank told, that like what my decision was. I gave it pretty clearly to opposition, and I'll give my reasons for why I thought this was the case, right? So right off the bat, before I go on to the main clashes that I saw in this debate and who I gave those clashes to, a couple of things that I saw that weren't really that material towards the debate, right? Firstly, on opposition's whole idea of political parties being logically fallible, right? Even if you come and tell me these things and you prove this to me, I don't see how it's relevant to the debate, right? Something that either side of the house must prove or disprove is whether anarchist political parties, anarchist elements of society deserve political representation. And secondly, what are the consequences of them taking place, right? Whether this idea is inherently good or bad. asking whether it's logically fallible isn't really adding much to the debate, and I don't see how it's relevant. So I couldn't really give it as much credit as it needs to, as opposition thought, right? Now, moving on to the main clashes. Firstly, the main clashes that I saw in today's debate was, firstly, the whole idea of whether rights exist, the right to representation, the right to choice. Secondly, and thirdly, when how Abhijeeth clearly demarcated into, firstly, if limited action exists, i.e. these political parties exist in the background but don't really get elected, and secondly, if they're elected and brought into power. So on this whole idea of limited action, right, government comes and tells me that they deserve representation because they'll exert additional pressure on the existing government political parties because of this whole idea of them being an anarchist political party. Firstly, opposition could mitigate this to some extent by saying that is the purpose of all opposition parties, and this pressure exists on governments to some extent. And this just mitigates his argument, doesn't really cancel it out, because Abhijeeth's reply to it was sufficient. But secondly, and more consequently, right, if these parties don't get any level of participation within the government system, then we don't see how it's really a threat to the present party, right? We need to understand that at least some level of limited responsibility will be given to these anarchist political parties, as in small amount of their members or whatever will be given participation. And as a consequence, something that was constantly brought up through opposition, there will exist chaos within like smaller levels, right? If an anarchist political party member is going to make decisions that could cause harm to the process, that could cause societal harm, if they refuse to give certain services that are expected of government officials, all these are going to cause positive harms, right? So on one side, government gives me mitigated benefits of certain political pressures existing on the current government, whereas opposition gives me tangible harms that I see could taking place, right? Where political members refuse to do their job. So that is an argument that I give to opposition, right? So secondly, the consequences of victory when when these parties come into power, right? One of the things the government told me was, firstly, that in the government whip speech, they told me that decentralization will take place, something that he focused on a lot, right? But I can't really credit this as much as they might have desired, because right off the bat, the prime minister accepted that, okay, if they come into power, they're going to lose, that there is going to be a destructuralization of government, and that only when people come back together after a very long time and decide a new, completely separate system, will there be a new formation of this thing, right? There isn't going to be a societal structure anymore, because that's what the people wanted, right? So I can't accept this whole idea of decentralization. Secondly, and mainly what they talked about was only if the government was a net negative, and only if the government was harmful for the very obviously harmful for the people, are they justified in being, are these parties justified in being elected? And this justification exists, right? And this is something that I can't really see much of a justification from side proposition, because first we need to ask the question that why does 30 or 40%, maybe at most 50% of the people's votes decide whether a societal structure should exist or not, right? Secondly, we don't see how a correlation between the government being a net negative, government being very obviously this bad, is necessarily going to cause these people to vote for anarchist political parties, right? They could, as Anirudh brought into his analysis extensively, that was his main core piece of argumentation of how these parties might get voted solely because people are discontent. People find it easy to blame a system. People might feel like this system doesn't deserve to exist, and that as a consequence, either due to ignorance or due to other factors that might or might not exist, could vote these people, right? Vote this party into power. And this is something that I see as a very tangible possibility, right? Something that can happen. And what do we see as consequences of this happening, right? Consequences of this happening was set up very clearly to me by Anirudh, something that he went through in the entirety of his speech, and something that the final whip speech also added with additional layers. He talked about how there was societal destructuralization, how large members of society aren't going to be given basic human rights, electricity and stuff like that is being taken away, how certain bad actors might come into place when there exists a political vacuum, something that we need to accept and acknowledge, right? All of these argumentations that come as a consequence of societal destructuralization is something that government proposition never even like try to deal with, right? And this is a big problem outside government. When we see all of these problems coming into play, we need to understand that when an anarchist political party comes into power, the consequences of victory is inherently harmful. So this again is a clash I give to opposition, right? So then this whole final clash of whether right to participation still exists, right? So then we need to analyze when exactly is it that right to choice is valid, right? Or right to participation or representation is valid. So if tangible harms exist in society, if harms exist in a large proportion of the population, then we feel that the right to choice isn't justified, right? That's why like the choice of someone to kill another person or manslaughter isn't under the purview of the right to choice, because it causes net harm on others, because it causes net harm on society. And this is something that Anirudh went into extensive logical analysis when he proved to me how a large proportion of the society's people are going to have their rights violated, how in a presence of a power vacuum, bad actors might come into play, how basic rights such as electricity, food, water, all of these things, societal structures, law enforcement, judicial systems, all of these things are going to be removed as a consequence of the anarchist political party coming into power. And when all of these problems come, I can't really put the right to choice on the same weighing scale as I would all the other rights that are lost as a consequence. So again, this whole argument of rights, I give it to opposition. And since I give all the major clashes to opposition, I gave the debate to opposition. Anything on any doubts?
Yeah, actually, I had a doubt. So, one second. Yeah. So, what arguments did opposition give you that there is a high probability of no public services, manslaughter, human rights violations, judicial systems not existing if an anarchist political party is voted in? Basically, what made you believe that there is a high probability?
So, look, I think that was a concession made right off the bat, right, by Abhijeeth, that if they are brought into power, that if an anarchist political party is brought into power, that means government structures and societal structures, that is their very purpose, is going to be removed, right? That these structures no longer need to exist, that the judiciary, which is a consequence of governmental structure, that law enforcement, which is a part of the governmental structure, all of these things aren't something that is going to continue to exist, right? And when these things are removed, it is very obvious to see that like government disseminated resources such as electricity and all these government controlled resources are going in their absence is going to cause like a massive violation of rights, right? Something that Anirudh throughout his speech gave like very deep analysis for. Compared to what you guys told me, government told me that just because they come into power, somehow there aren't going to be any harms. I don't really see that.
Yeah, I think this is why the decentralization point was brought up, but yeah, you didn't understand or accept that, so it's fine.
Yeah, I couldn't accept decentralization because I think the concession was made right off the bat that decentralization still means that to some extent there exists powers or parties that control a large portion of communities or societies, right? Just not at the extent that exists currently. So even then, it's something that I can't accept because that means that there exists concentration of powers with like certain actors. If that's it, then I guess I'll call Aadarsh.
Thank you, Joel, for your speech.
Yeah, hello. Hello.
Yeah, Aadarsh, you're audible. Hello.
Yeah, I'm audible, right?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Am I supposed to turn on my video?
Yep.
Okay, 1 second. Cool. So I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so as you guys probably know already, we gave the debate to op on a 2-1 split. Me and Joel gave it to op, and Mayank gave it to Goel. So I'll try to go through the debate and tell you why I think op won. But before that, I'll give some sort of general criticism. I felt particularly when it comes to like morals and ethics, there was a lot of assertion, not much backing up. So I'll give you a couple of examples. In the Prime Minister's speech, I get from Abhijeeth that, look, representation of ideas is a principal requirement. And then you move on to your next argument. I felt that needed to be explained a lot more for that to have a lot of weight. Similarly, on op from Shashwat in his first speech, I get democracy is morally correct because college campus debates are generally about democracy. I don't think that is a good enough justification either. Right. But coming to why I think opposition won the debate. So I'm going to look at it through the framework that Abhijeeth set up because I think that's very convenient. So there are two cases really, right? What happens in the short term if these parties don't win, and then what happens in the long term, like what happens if they win and the situation, how it changes then, right? So let's start by talking about the short term. So I get a couple of claims from government. Firstly, they tell me we get better democracy, as in the first reason is because people's ideas are more represented. The second reason they give me is because this puts pressure on other political parties to now act in a better way, because if they don't, they'll be thrown out by an anarchy that will destroy the government altogether. And thirdly, from Pahul, I get that look, people already have anarchical leanings. They just don't have a good platform to say it. It's stuck in dark corners of the internet. It's better to have it out and in the open. So in response to this, I get a couple of things from Op. Firstly, I get anarchy is an oxymoron. I don't really think I didn't really weigh that super heavily in the debate. I think that was more concerning the wording of the debate. But what I do credit to Op under this sort of oxymoron point is that if you become an MP, you're by definition forced to not be particularly faithful to your ideas that you don't like a government, right? And then the second thing I get from Op is that, look, if you're an MP, you probably won't work. And Srijan gave the example of a fire department, vaccination guy not giving you proper vaccination and stuff. So why did I give this flash to government? Firstly, I got no response to the argument about political pressure. We got one attempted response in a POI, which I think Abhijeeth, we got handled pretty well, where this threat of anarchy is more strong than political opposition in a democracy. So parties will be more scared of anarchy and hence will act in a better way, right? And the main problem with Op's arguments here was, I think Shashwat gave a couple of good arguments where, look, even in the status quo, all MPs are not working well, whereas their arguments are specifically exclusive to this anarchical situation where, you get better representation of people's ideas, you get better democracy because political parties are forced to work better, and you get better spreading of anarchy and such ideas. Srijan tries to combat this last point by saying, look, there are other platforms where you can spread these ideas, but he doesn't really give me an example of these platforms, so I didn't really weigh that as a strong rebuttal. And overall, I think in the short term, by government's case, the democracy becomes better and people's choice is better upheld, right? Then we come to the second part of this debate, which is what happens in the long term. So what we get from government is look, this can only happen when life is so bad that the government must collapse, right? And what we get from Op is a whole host of things. Firstly, there are other scenarios where people could vote for an anarchist party, for example, a global pandemic where we see people are generally already unhappy with the government. Secondly, we get how this sort of anarchist government takes away the choice of people who did not vote for the anarchy as well. And hence this is bad because you take away all future rights of these people. Thirdly, Anirudh talks about a power vacuum and how this is extremely bad because of violence and there'll be a battle for power. So this Shashwat says, look, there have been societies that have had this, and it has, and not every society has had this type of battle. But Anirudh does come and say there have been some societies where it has been. It is a possibility, and we need to think about it. And I agree with him. Then the last thing he says is it's very hard to reinstate democracy, even if you want to 100 years down the line, right? Which Abhijeeth just comes and says, look, maybe if you want democracy later, you can get it the way you got it historically, because democracy has not always been a historical thing. But I do buy that it's extremely hard to reinstate democracy like that, and that and the big thing I buy here from Op's case is that people are going to suffer massively when they talk about food stamps not, for example, being given to people who need them. When you talk about essential services that collapse when this sort of anarchist party happens. So the main response I get to all of this material from Gov is, look, this is an exaggerated case. It's not always going to happen. It's not necessary that an anarchist party will, that voting an anarchist party will lead to these sort of things. But I think weighing all the material that I got from Op and all the possibilities together, it is an extremely important factor to consider in this debate. And I give this sort of long-term effect clash to the opposition. So then what does my thought process become while judging the debate, right? So it becomes, is the risk of this societal collapse that opposition talks about, is it worth the risk for short-term benefits in democracy and political parties and in freedom of choice? And here I think opposition wins this debate when Anirudh comes and talks to me about how there's certain cases where you have to sacrifice choice for the betterment of society as a whole, where societal like good is often taken as the most important thing. When he talks about how like policing is extremely essential for keeping people safe, when he talks about like food distribution and stuff, I think when you give me these links between why it's more important to protect society from this massive collapse than to worry about the short-term freedom of choice, I think at that point opposition wins this debate, because they prove to me how their sort of worst case is so bad that we always need to stay away from it, and any short-term benefits like aren't like worth the risk, right? So for those reasons, I think opposition won this debate. Yeah, any questions?
This is a little bit less of a question. It's more about like how you interpreted some of the arguments that, especially regarding the exaggeration and misinterpretation rebuttal.
Yeah.
Essentially, what I was saying throughout all my speech, I'm not sure if you picked up on this, but I was attacking essentially how the opposition was structuring the anarchist party coming into power. They essentially were structuring it based off of people being unhappy here, feeling that the system is unfair, and thus deciding that doing away with the system is the best choice. And that's what I was referring to as an exaggeration rather than the harms. And this is something that we tried to make pretty clear from the beginning. We tried to say that we're not saying that anarchy itself is good. We're just saying that if it reaches a point where people want anarchy, then the only time it reaches that situation is that the government has screwed up miserably. That's what you're trying to say, but I'm assuming that didn't come through. Could you?
Yeah, so I understand that's what you're trying to say.
Why that happened?
So I think when Anirudh comes and tells me like, look around right now, and there's a global pandemic and people are extremely dissatisfied with the government, and hence people are going to potentially feel like they need an anarchist party. I buy that, right? Because I think that is that I got enough backing for that. As in, sure, it's a bad situation right now, but when he comes and tells me that having a government in this sort of situation is better than not having a government, I bought that argument, and hence I think I buy that there's a massive risk of collapse and stuff.
Okay, thank you. So just to summarize, one second, Shashwat. So you're saying that people will, it's likely for people to take down a government because governments aren't performing as good as they want them to, even though the governments are still performing.
Yeah, so I'm saying when when Pahul comes and says, look, people already feel very anarchist. Is anarchist the word? I'm not sure. Anyways, when you say that there are already a group of people who feel like this, when Anirudh comes and says, look around, you see people who are extremely dissatisfied with the government. To your argument, which is it can never happen, without too much analysis, I bought their argument more.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. 1 second. Shashwat, you had a question, right?
Yeah. No, I think it got answered in the last part of like what you said just now, so it's fine.
Okay, cool. So yeah, that's it from me, I guess. I thought it was pretty interesting. I liked the way it went overall. Fairly straightforward, as in it didn't get completely deviated into something crazy.
Okay.
But yeah,
thanks for your
I'm
speech,
done.
Aadarsh. Okay, with that, we conclude the second day of the exhibition tournament. Yeah, so in the Shashwat, Anirudh, and Srijan will be moving on to the finals. Congratulations to them.
Thank you for the debate. It's pretty cool.
Okay, let me just stop the recording.
Yeah, stop it.
GG. It's fine.
GG. Nice.
GG.